All right, so let's continue on talking about communication. Um, One thing that is important for this class and for your your future career in any of the helping professions is knowing about people first language. This is a big um, sort of new thing, and essentially what it is we used to say things like you'd see this in a lot of academic papers, but I would say like autists don't do X or something like that. They don't have good interpersonal social skills or something like that. And so we're kind of moving away from that. Um, so instead, we're saying like people with autism instead of autists, or um, people with uh, deafness or hearing difficulties instead of deaf people, right? So the reason why we do this change is because that kind of depersonalizes the person by putting the disorder first, or by just referring to them as whatever the disorder is. So it depersonalizes the person. It kind of puts the focus on the problem rather than the person. And the focus should be on the person. Remember that it's always a person you're dealing with. You're not treating the problem first. You're working with a person who has some sort of disability. And so it's called person first language, which kind of gives away what, how to use it. You put the person first. So you would say children with autism, people with hearing loss, instead of, like I said earlier, autistic children, deaf people, right? We also don't use terms like afflicted, sufferer, and victim. So usually you'll say, just person with something instead of sufferers of blah, victims of blah, something like that. People that are confined to wheelchair, because this guy isn't necessarily confined in any way. I mean, he's still got the best costume at this convention, I assume is what it is. Which is it's a totally awesome costume. I assume that's like his mom or his older sister, or maybe just some lady he found. I don't know. So, and then again, this is just showing, instead of Oedipus is autistic, it's Oedipus has autism, is the way that you would write that. But we know Oedipus has way different, way crazier things going on than just typical autism. So Oedipus wishes that that's what was going on with him. Also, I forgot to turn on my light. So then we should also discuss the difference between impairment and disability. So an impairment is just a loss of typical function, right? Or a difference in typical anatomy. So, for instance, you've got high frequency hearing loss, and it could be extraordinarily high frequency hearing loss. Now, this would be necessarily a hearing impairment, because if we, were able to demonstrate that people with typical hearing levels have, just fine high frequency hearing loss, but you have someone with impaired high frequency hearing, it is an impairment. It might not actually affect their ability to hear, though. If it's extreme high frequency hearing loss, they would still be fine. In fact, they might not necessarily look any different than anybody else. So in that case, it wouldn't necessarily be a disability. The disability actually has to impact their ability to function as they want to. So what this says here, I've got a picture over top of it, but it says an inability to discriminate speech in a noisy environment. That's when it becomes a disability, but otherwise it's an impairment. So they're two totally different things. I mean, we can say that there's an impairment or some sort of difference in function, but it doesn't necessarily cause a disability. The disability comes in when the way that the person wants to function is hindered. So that's when it becomes a disability. So a disorder, like colloquially we use it either way. It can be an impairment or a disability. Here, we're in this class we're talking about it, and in most of your SLP schooling in general, we're going to talk about it as like any structure or function that's diminished in any way. So, like my lisp is a disorder. It's not a disability. You can still understand me just fine, and I don't really care to change it. I would, but also seems like work. I'm busy enough. I don't really need that, so it's fine. It's not a disability, but it is a disorder. And then we've also got communication differences. It's really important to understand the difference between disorder and difference. Difference is not a disorder or a disability or an impairment. It's just that there's a difference. So sometimes I feel like maybe not in Arizona, because we have a lot, we know more about non-English speakers. Well, I would hope we do. I don't know if that's true in all areas of Arizona, but we're right on the border. We have tons of English as a second language students and adults in the state. So you'd hope that we would all kind of understand that some, accents have some differences, and we wouldn't make the mistake of saying that there's a disorder there. But in other states where there's, that's more unique, you might find that in schools, some children are marked as having a communication disorder, some speech sound problems, but actually it's not a problem. It's an accent. B and V sound very similar in Spanish, but they don't in English, and so it's possible that someone would get marked as having some sort of disorder, and they don't at all. And then also, this is the King of Spain, not the current King of Spain, but an old King of Spain from a long time ago. And there is something called the Castilian lisp. So Castilian Spanish, like specifically, if everything has, like a lisp in it. And there's a story that I'm not sure, I cannot verify if it's true or not. I've tried to look into this because I'm really interested to know if it's a true story or if it's just, one of those historical things that's kind of made up. But the story is that this guy had a lisp, so he did have a communication disorder. But then, by royal decree, changed the language so that all S's should be pronounced with a lisp. They were dentalized, and then he didn't have a communication disorder. He was actually the one that was speaking the language correctly, and everyone else had to adapt. So, kind of an interesting story. Again, I'm not totally sure how true it is. And I've looked, man, I cannot find reputable resources either way. There's some evidence that says it's true, there's some that says it's fake. And, it's possible that there's just not any documents to show. But anyway, let's talk about different types of communication disorders. We've got two subsets of two is the best way to think about this. So the first one is it's either organic or functional. Organic means it's physical in nature, like we can identify a physical cause. Something has actually happened to create this disorder. And functional, we can't find a physical cause. So my lisp, for example, is functional. We don't really know why it's there. It's something that I have, but there's nothing that brought it on. So it's not like I had traumatic brain injury and then started having a lisp or something like that. That would be an organic disorder, but this is a functional disorder. A lot of speech disorders that you'd find in children in schools are functional disorders. Not saying their R's correctly are functional, unless they have some sort of malformation of their tongue or jaw that doesn't allow them to say the R, and then it's an organic disorder. And then your other set of opposites is developmental and acquired. Developmental is something that the child's born with. It just kind of follows your typical speech language development, but it's delayed. So again, my lisp is something it's a developmental thing. Acquired it came later. So TBI, any sort of TBI, is both organic and acquired. So, and that's because you're born normal, and then you have traumatic brain injury. That's acquired because you were developing typically, and then you had something happen to you, so you've acquired this disorder. And it's organic because we can trace it back to a physical cause, which would be that acquired TBI. Most of the, again, speech disorders that you see in schools are functional and developmental. Okay, so let's run through a quick quiz. What about slurring caused by a stroke? Is that organic or functional? If you said that it was organic, you are correct, because we know that there was a stroke. Is slurring caused by a stroke developmental or acquired? It's acquired. Same as TBI, really. I mean, in a way, injuries caused as a result of stroke are TBI. They are kind of traumatic brain injuries. Usually we talk about traumatic brain injuries as like a blow to the head or something entering the brain, like a shrapnel or a bullet or something like that. But it's any sort of brain injury, so a stroke is a brain injury in a way. They would have the same definition of cause. So it's an organic and an acquired disorder. What about Elmer Fudd's pronunciation? Well, it's a lot like those disorders that you'd see in schools, right? So it's functional. We don't see a cause for it. And also it's developmental. He's presumably had it all his life. And I believe that in some of the like super old cartoons, they show the history between Elmer Fudd and Bugs, and he's had it then too. So it's not like it's TBI. It's not like he fell down at one point and shot himself and then he couldn't say the R's. Though if he did, it'd be an organic and acquired disorder. But as it is, it seems like it's a functional and developmental disorder. What about you can't make a K sound because of cleft palate? Well, we know that this is an organic disorder because we can identify that it is the cleft palate that is causing the problem. It's kind of a gray area whether it's developmental or acquired, though, right? Because in a way, it's developmental. The child's always had this problem. It's not like you just wake up one day and you have a cleft palate. So it's like a developmental disorder, except that it's not just something that has come out of learning. It's not following the typical trajectory. So there's some parts that kind of look acquired. I would call it a developmental thing, an organic developmental disorder. It's there. It's present at birth. It's there while the child develops, but we know the cause of it. And, with cleft palate, we can fix it pretty well. But we'll talk about that later on in the semester as well. And this guy, okay, so who knows this person on the right? I'm assuming some of you do. He has a little bit of a lisp too. But I don't know if you know this. His is actually caused by a genetic condition. Which it also does something weird to the shoulders. A lot of people with his, I knew what his condition was a couple days ago, but I don't remember the name of it now. Anyway, it causes the shoulders to kind of, I think, rotate in or out. They're closer than they should be. And then also not having all the teeth is another symptom of this disorder. Some people have it a lot worse than he does. But so his, even though it sounds like a lisp like mine, it's different because it's organic. We know that there's something, there's a genetic disorder causing it. So the actual nature, even though the disorder sounds the same, is different. So it's an organic disorder, and again, this is another one of those like the cleft palate, where it's kind of a gray area. But again, this is something that's been there since birth, so I would call it an organic developmental disorder. Whereas, again, MyLisp is a functional developmental disorder. And then this guy, if you like a lot of British game shows, which I do, they're amazing, then you might know this guy. Maybe you don't, which is totally fine. But he pronounces R's kind of like Elmer Fudd. And so what do you think about that? Well, it's a trick question. Haha. Because you already know what Elmer Fudd's disorder is, but his is a communication difference. He comes from a part of England where you don't pronounce the R. It's called a de-rhoticism, which is a funny phrase for it. So, but, you know, rhotic is an R, and they're taking the R out of this language, so it's a de-rhotic language, or accent, I should say, de-rhotic dialect. So they just don't pronounce it. There's no disorder at all. It's just another communication difference. So you kind of have to know the history of the person as well. Because if it was anybody else, you might say that it was an actual communication disorder. Okay, so here's a slide. I don't like this slide. I've been using it for a little while, and I've tried to make it a little bit better. It's still really ugly. I want to make it. I should work on this slide. But anyway, we've got a few different categories. We've got articulation disorders, which we talked about. Articulation disorders are the speech effectors, the mouth, the tongue, sometimes the pharynx. So you can have actual, just straight up problems with articulation. So the actual production of the sound. You can have phonological disorders. This is the actual speech sound representation in the brain. So that they're not articulated correctly, but it's not a problem with the effectors. It's a problem with the representation, the cognitive representation. And then you can also have motor speech disorders where the effectors are good and the representation in the brain is good, but somehow the signal from brain to effector is kind of misfiring. So those are all kind of subsets of articulation disorder. Then we've got fluency disorders. Those are disruptions in the rhythm of the speech. And you've got stuttering, where the speech is sometimes slowed down like that. And then you've got cluttering, which is actually kind of the opposite, where the speech goes much too fast, right on top of each other. And you can see how both of those are disruptions in the typical rhythm of speech. Then we've got voice disorders. Just problems with vocal fold vibration, and then there's resonance disorders as well. So those are problems with vibrations further up in the system. So you've got vocal fold vibrations, then you've got resonance disorders. So like hypernasality, if you're letting too much air go into the nasal cavity, or hyponasality, where you're not letting enough resonance go into the nasal cavity. Language disorders, these are a little bit more cognitive, but not in the cognitive area yet. So we've got, these are kind of lumped in. So we've got language disorders, then literacy disorders, so either reading or writing. And then this subset of cognitive disorders goes right inside there as well. So you've got developmental cognitive disorders, like there's a ton. I mean, it's one of the first areas we get to, but there's a lot of problems that can impact a lot of the stages of communication. So you can have some that affect just general intelligence, and that can slow down the learning process. One of those is Down syndrome, where the process is actually just slowed down, but not disordered exactly. It's they're slow at picking things up, but they do progress typically. And with enough time, they'll have the same speech patterns that a typical birth would, but it's a little bit slower. And then another example of a developmental cognitive disorder might be autism, where they can pick up speech patterns. Well, depending on the severity of the autism, they can pick up the speech patterns just fine. It's actually the pragmatics, the talking to other people, that is the problem. So they pronounce the words correctly, and they get it at about the same time that typical development would say that they would. But the way that they interact, the way that they use the words, is the part that's different. And then you've got acquired disorders. This is like TBI, stroke, and other things. We talked about tumors, things like that. And then lastly, we've got hearing, which is kind of off by itself because it's very different from everything else. Conductive loss, sensory neural loss, and mixed loss. These are actually just different types of hearing loss. Conductive is like a blockage in the ear. Sensory neural is actually damage to the hair cells, and mixed is a combination of the two. So these are all the different classes of disorders that we're going to talk about throughout the entire course. All right. I think this is... Yeah, okay. So just to talk about language disorders, that's where we're going to go first in the class. It's kind of like a delay, right? So there's two different types. We've got delays, we've got actual complete disorders. But some kids are just behind the curve. This is where your functional disorders come up. So some kids don't learn how to say their R's at around the same time that other kids do. They might get them later, and about 50% of people that are delayed will pick this up later, but that means 50% don't. One of the problems facing SLPs is that you can't actually... Early intervention is key to getting these kids to say the speech sounds correctly and intelligibly. However, it's hard to intervene early when you cannot start intervention until they're delayed. I mean, you have to know that they're going to be delayed in this, so you have to wait until they still can't say R's, until 90% of normal children have learned their R's. Then they're delayed, and then you can start an intervention process. But by that time, they're already behind. So it's kind of this problem where, we want to intervene earlier, but what if they're the tail of that distribution that might pick it up anyway? It's kind of a catch-22. But there are, again, some that just won't pick it up. Especially without help. This is overcoming it naturally. Of the 50% that don't overcome it naturally, a good portion do with therapy, but still not necessarily everybody. And then we have actual disorders. We have developmental disorders. So you've got that subset of the delay that persists. That becomes a disorder. And then also there are some things that aren't part of the typical development. And that's a red flag that it's a disorder way ahead of time. So you can actually start early intervention with things that aren't part of typical development. One of those things is fronting and backing. So fronting is part of typical development. And what that means is... you'll move your consonants towards the front of the mouth. This makes sense. If children are learning how to speak based on both what they hear from the people that they're learning from and what they see, if you say p and t and things like that, and they can actually, they see it easily without you over-enunciating it, they'll start moving things in the front that might sound like that. So instead of a k, they might say t. So tup instead of cup. Totally normal. They sound similar, especially because they don't have the experience with language like we do. We can hear the difference between a k and a t. To them, it's just some sort of like sound that is similar. And so they're saying tup. Because they can see what people are doing when they make a t sound. So this is part of typical development. And if you had someone, if you had a child that was saying T instead of K, T instead of K, you wouldn't be able to intervene right away because maybe it's just a delay. It's typical. You'd have to wait to see if they were actually, delayed. Now, if you had some child that was saying K instead of T, that's weird. That's backing. And it's very unusual to move the consonants further back in the mouth because we can't see what's going on there. So if you have somebody saying K instead of T, it's strange. It's not typical. And then that's a red flag that there is a disorder there. It could be something with the palate. It could be a cleft palate. It could be just a speech sound disorder, a cognitive disorder possibly. But that's one red flag. Other than that, there's a variety of causes for a lot of these disorders too. It's not just one. Sometimes people are slow at getting these things. Sometimes there could be a little bit of hearing abnormality that's not allowing them to pick up on the auditory information, so they're only relying on visual. Sometimes it's the opposite, where they don't have sufficient visual information and they're only relying on the audio, and other things that we'll talk about. Well, again, we talked about acquired, so I don't really need to go into that again. But strokes, brain injuries, viral infections like meningitis, these are all acquired disorders that can affect neural functioning. Then we've also got age-related changes like dementia, and those are also acquired. And those can impact linguistic functioning as well. Okay, so speech communication, we already talked about this actually. We're going to skip over that. This is just saying what we're doing first. So everything inside this box, this rounded out box, is something that happens in the brain. So the thoughts and feelings, they become words, they're programmed into a motor sequence. That all happens in the brain. Then out of the brain, that motor sequence is moved. The effectors move to execute that motor sequence. Acoustic energy travels across the medium, and then it's converted into an electrochemical signal in the listener. Once it's converted into the electrochemical signal, you're back in the brain. It's recognized as speech, then processed for words, and then it becomes thoughts and feelings again. And what we're going to talk about in this first part of class is these three with the arrows next to them. We're going to talk about encoding the words, programming the motor sequences, and production from the speech effectors. So we're going to be focusing on speech communication in the first part. In the last quarter of the class we're going to be focusing on all of this hearing over here. So we're decoding into words, recognizing a speech, and converting into an electrochemical signal. So a good 2/3 of the class is devoted to the speech communication part. Well, we talked about phonemes already, that those are the smallest perceptually distinct units of speech. So every vowel and consonant, all those different sounds, those are all phonemes. And those can be measured in different ways. So these are vowels. This is how vowels are usually measured. We measure them by the jaw height and the position in the mouth. So if you say E, go ahead and do it. Like you're just watching this, I know. But go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter if you look stupid. Say E. E. Come on. E. There. Okay, good. Thank you. So, you can feel where that is, right? E, it's towards the front. You're making the sound towards the front. And your jaw, think about where your jaw is. E, it's very closed. So you can see how you've got your jaw closed right here. Now say, ah. Your jaw is fallen way open. E-ah. way further down. And then say where it feels like the constriction is, e, ah, it's way further back, right? So your jaw has fallen, but then also you can feel that vowel is being produced further back. Ah, e, and then oo is a little bit in the middle, maybe, kind of a little bit further back, but oo, you still have your jaw closed. So this is one of the ways that we can measure vowels, and these vowels are some of our phonemes. We've got consonants. We can measure them in a similar way, but there's more than 2 dimensions, so it's actually kind of a mess to put on a slide. We'll talk about it later, but hey, look, there's unbearable. I didn't realize that I'd used that twice. I thought I totally just came up with that, unbearable, in the last video. I didn't realize I'd use it. I must love that word. That's crazy. But anyway, morphemes are the smallest units of speech. Un, bear, able, all morphemes. Oh, here's the consonant thing. But you can see how it's kind of a mess. It's hard to explain. It'll take a lot of time. And we'll do it, but we'll do it when we actually get to that part of the course. There's a few other parts of speech that we'll talk about right here at the very end of this lecture. Semantics, as you know, those are the relation of thoughts and feelings to words. This is the thing we talked about that sometimes people with autism have some trouble with, is knowing exactly when to use this. Pragmatics is another area where they might have some trouble. This is the social conventions on word choice and word forms. What to do while you're talking to somebody else, how to listen and agree with what they've said and things like that. That's all pragmatics. Lexicon is the internal body of word knowledge. So that's how many words do you know and how many forms of words do you know. This is your lexicon, your internal lexicon. And then lastly, syntax. This is basically grammar, right? This is what you can think of as grammar, is syntax. And those are other parts of speech. And that is the last part of the communication lecture, or series of lectures. The next one that we'll talk about are careers in speech and hearing and audiology.